They said the forest was quiet that night. No wind, no insects, no birds. Just a man standing barefoot at the edge of the trees, his clothes soaked with sweat, his eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Minutes later, the woman who trusted him most was dead. The house was silent. The forest did not react. And when the police arrived, they would all agree on one thing that still chills me to this day. Whatever happened there did not feel human. Because this wasn't rage. It wasn't fear. It was obedience. And the woods were watching. If stories like this get under your skin and stay there, subscribe to Whispers in the Dark. People don't vanish in places like this by accident. Not anymore. The forest I'm talking about sits just outside Olympic National Park in Washington State, a place so dense and ancient that sunlight struggles to reach the ground even at noon. The trees there are not thin or welcoming. They are massive, bloated with age, their bark split and scarred like old wounds that never healed properly. Moss hangs from their branches in thick curtains, swaying slowly even when there is no wind. And the silence is not the peaceful kind people romanticize. It's the kind that presses against your eardrums, as if the forest itself is holding its breath. Locals don't advertise this place. They don't put it on postcards. And if you ask them directly about the trail that disappears into those woods, most of them will pause before answering. Some will shrug and say it's dangerous terrain. Others will laugh it off and tell you people get lost all the time. But every now and then, if you catch someone in the right mood or the wrong one, they'll say something else entirely. They'll say, "That's the last place people go when they don't want to be found." I didn't believe any of this the first time I heard it. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily, and I don't buy into folklore just because it sounds poetic. I like explanations. I like causes and effects. And for most of my life, I believed that fear was just a trick of the mind, an evolutionary leftover meant to keep us alive. That belief didn't survive this forest. It's important to understand that people don't just disappear inside the woods. They disappear around them. They stop calling their families. They abandon cars on the shoulder of the road with the doors unlocked and the keys still in the ignition. Search parties find footprints that suddenly end as if the person simply stepped out of reality. Dogs refuse to follow certain trails. Compasses spin. Batteries drain. And every time, without fail, someone will say the same thing afterward. It felt like we weren't welcome there. The first time I stood at the edge of those trees, I felt it too. It wasn't fear, not at first. It was something colder. Something more deliberate. A sense that I was being measured. Judged. As if the forest wasn't just a place, but a presence, quietly deciding whether I belonged among the living or the missing. And here's my personal opinion, the one people usually don't like hearing. I don't think this forest is haunted. I think it's worse than that. Haunted places suggest something left behind: ghosts, echoes, remnants of the dead. But this place doesn't feel like it's holding on to the past. It feels active. Patient. Like it's still doing what it was always meant to do. Take the missing persons reports, for example. Over the past 30 years, dozens of people have vanished in or near these woods. Hikers, campers, photographers, even experienced park rangers. Official explanations always circle back to the same tired conclusions: exposure, accidents, wildlife. But if you actually read the reports, if you read between the lines, you'll notice a pattern that doesn't sit right. Many of these people were found alive days later, wandering miles away from where they were last seen. Dehydrated, disoriented. Some with injuries they couldn't explain, and almost all of them shared one detail that authorities quietly dismissed as shock or trauma. They all said they heard something. Not a voice exactly. Not words. More like a presence announcing itself. A pressure in the air. A certainty that they were no longer alone, even when they couldn't see anyone else. One man, a former Marine, mentally sound by every professional standard, described it as being watched by something that didn't have eyes. Another said, the forest leaned closer the deeper he went. A woman sobbed uncontrollably during her interview and begged officers never to make her say what she saw between the trees. And then there are the people who never come back at all. Search teams talk about them in hushed tones, usually after a few drinks, usually when they think no one is recording. They'll tell you about finding campsites where the food was still warm, about tents neatly packed, as if someone had carefully cleaned up before vanishing, about radios picking up static that sounded almost like breathing. But the story that refuses to leave my mind, the one that keeps me awake at night, started with a single sentence in a police report that no one bothered to explain. Subject was last seen, standing motionless at the tree line, facing inward. Not running, not hiding, standing, as if waiting. That sentence tells me everything I need to know about what lives in those woods. Because people don't stand still when they're afraid. They don't calmly face the thing that terrifies them most. Unless they believe somehow that it's already too late. I've spent years thinking about that moment. About what must go through a person's mind when they stop trying to escape. And the conclusion I've come to is deeply unsettling. I think the forest doesn't chase you. I think it convinces you. Convince you that stopping is easier than running. That surrender feels like relief. That whatever is watching you already knows you better than you know yourself. And if that's true, if something out there understands human weakness that intimately, then the devil doesn't need horns or fire or ritual circles. The devil just needs trees. This is the place where people go when something inside them is already broken, where grief, guilt, and exhaustion walk hand in hand into the dark. And the forest doesn't judge them for it. It welcomes them. That's why I believe this is the last place people go to disappear. Not because they get lost, but because something in the woods helps them decide not to come back. And the worst part? I don't think it's finished. He wasn't a violent man. That's the detail everyone keeps getting wrong. When people hear what he eventually did, what he became, they instinctively search backward for signs. Anger issues. A dark past. Some buried cruelty that finally clawed its way to the surface. It's comforting to believe that monsters always announce themselves early, that evil leaves fingerprints long before it acts. But this man didn't fit that narrative at all. And that's exactly why his story still terrifies me. His name wasn't famous anymore by the time everything fell apart, but once upon a time, it had been. He had been a familiar face on screens large and small, the kind of performer people described as gentle and thoughtful in interviews. Not flashy, not explosive. He gravitated toward quiet roles, introspective characters. People who carried more weight in their eyes than in their fists. Off camera, he was the same way. Friends described him as soft-spoken, almost delicate in the way he moved through the world. He hated confrontation. He hated loud rooms. He preferred conversations that drifted into philosophy, into meaning, into the strange and beautiful things people usually only admit to thinking about at 3 in the morning. Violence, even fictional violence, unsettled him. He once walked off a project because he couldn't stomach a scene that required him to look angry enough. That detail matters more than people realize. Because men who fear violence don't suddenly wake up craving it. They don't flip a switch. They erode. And erosion is quiet. Before the forest entered his life, He was already pulling away from the noise of the world. Success had exhausted him. Fame felt invasive. He told people it was like being constantly observed, like never having a private thought that didn't echo somewhere it didn't belong. I understand that feeling more than I wish I did. There's something deeply unsettling about being seen too much, about realizing the world feels entitled to your inner life. So he withdrew. He read obsessively old texts, forgotten philosophies, obscure folklore. He started sketching again, something he hadn't done since childhood. The drawings were strange, though no one thought to be alarmed at the time. Abstract shapes, repeating symbols. Trees that looked less like plants and more like veins stretching upward into darkness. He said the woods helped him think, and maybe they did at first. Here's where my opinion begins to diverge from the official story. People like to frame what happened next as a simple mental health decline. Stress, depression, burnout. And yes, those things were present. But they weren't the cause. They were the invitation. You see, people don't fall apart unless something pushes where they're already fragile. And this man, gentle, sensitive, deeply introspective, was fragile in a way the modern world doesn't know how to protect. He felt too much. He noticed too much. And that made him porous. When he moved closer to the forest, he told friends it felt like coming home, which should have been the first red flag. Not because the woods are inherently evil, but because of the certainty with which he said it. As if the place recognized him before he ever learned its name. He began spending hours walking alone among the trees, often without a phone, sometimes without telling anyone where he was going. When asked what he did out there, he struggled to explain. He said time behaved differently. That thoughts didn't feel like they belonged entirely to him anymore. That sentence haunts me. Because there's a difference between inspiration and intrusion. Slowly, subtly, the man people knew began to thin out. He slept less, ate irregularly. His eyes took on a distant quality, like he was listening to something just beyond the range of human hearing. Conversations drifted. He'd pause mid-sentence, brow furrowed, as if someone else had interrupted him from the inside. Still no anger. No violence. No warning signs anyone could point to with confidence. And that's the most dangerous part. We expect evil to be loud. We expect it to arrive with clenched fists and raised voices. But whatever was happening to him moved like fog. It didn't demand. It suggested. It didn't scream. It waited. He once told a friend that the forest didn't feel alive the way animals feel alive. It felt aware. Not conscious in a human sense, but attentive, like something ancient that had learned the rhythms of people over centuries and knew exactly when to step forward and when to remain still. At the time, it sounded poetic, artistic, harmless. Now it sounds like a confession. He started dreaming about trees even when he wasn't near them. Not nightmares, at least not at first. The dreams were calm, almost tender. He described standing among trunks so tall he couldn't see their tops, feeling something behind him that never touched him, never spoke, but filled him with an overwhelming sense of purpose. That word again. Purpose. I've come to believe that's the hook. That's how the forest gets you. Not through fear, but through meaning. It offers the one thing most broken people crave more than comfort, a reason. And once someone accepts that, once they believe they were chosen, noticed, understood, it's already too late. Because the man I'm telling you about didn't want to hurt anyone. I believe that with everything I have. I believe he would have been horrified by the idea that his hands could ever cause pain. But I also believe something else. Something far more disturbing. I believe he stopped seeing himself as the one in control. When a person begins to feel like an observer inside their own body, when they start interpreting their impulses as messages instead of thoughts. Morality becomes negotiable. Responsibility blurs. Actions feel inevitable instead of chosen. And that's not possession in the Hollywood sense. That's something much more believable. And much more terrifying. The forest didn't turn him into a monster. It convinced him he was never alone to begin with. And once that belief took root, the man everyone remembered, the gentle one, the peaceful one, began to fade. Not violently. Not dramatically. He just made room. And in my opinion, that's the most horrifying transformation of all. Because if someone like him can disappear without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened, then the line between who we are and what we could become is far thinner than we want to admit. And the woods know it. There is always a moment people point to later and say, that's when everything changed. They're almost always wrong. Because change like this doesn't happen at the moment of impact. It happens in the silence immediately after, when everyone assumes the worst is already over. The accident itself wasn't dramatic. That's another uncomfortable truth. No screeching tires, no fireball, no headline-worthy catastrophe. Just a slick stretch of road near the forest's edge, damp with early morning mist, and a man who misjudged a curve he had driven 100 times before. The report would later describe it in clinical language: minor injuries, brief loss of consciousness, no immediate neurological red flags. He was lucky, they said. Incredibly lucky. A few inches in another direction and it could have been fatal. I've learned to distrust that word lucky when it's spoken too quickly. He woke up in the hospital under fluorescent lights that hummed faintly, like insects trapped behind glass. Nurses asked him simple questions. His name. The date. Where he was. He answered all of them correctly, though he said it felt like someone else was speaking through him, like his voice had a half-second delay. That detail never made it into the chart. What did make it in was patient reports' confusion and patient reports' vivid imagery prior to regaining consciousness. Doctors hear that every day. They nodded, reassured him, told him it was normal. The brain, they explained, doesn't like being interrupted. It fills the gaps with nonsense. But what if it isn't nonsense? He told me quietly, months later, with the careful tone of someone afraid to sound insane, that when he lost consciousness, he didn't go dark. There was no void, no tunnel, no comforting cliché. He said he stood up. Not in the hospital, not on the road, in the forest. Not the forest as people imagine it, either. Not birdsong and filtered sunlight. This forest was dense to the point of claustrophobia. Trees pressed in from every direction, their trunks too close together, their roots rising from the soil like grasping fingers. The air was thick, heavy, damp with something that smelled older than decay. He could move, but the ground resisted him, as if each step required permission. And here is the part that makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. He said he wasn't afraid. Not because the place was peaceful, but because fear didn't feel appropriate there. Like laughing at a funeral or whispering in a hurricane. Whatever that place was, it didn't threaten him. It acknowledged him. He felt seen. There was something behind him. He never turned to look. He was very clear about that. Not because he couldn't, but because every instinct he had told him that if he did, something irreversible would happen. Not death. Not madness. Recognition. He said, it felt like standing in front of something ancient that had already decided who you were, long before you ever had a chance to argue. Then someone said his name. Not aloud. Not in words. Just a pull, a pressure, like a hand closing gently around his spine. And he woke up. When I tell people this part, they usually nod politely and chalk it up to trauma. A dream. A hallucination. The mind protecting itself. I used to agree with them. I don't anymore. Because when he was discharged, something about him had shifted in a way that didn't register on any scan. He was more sensitive to light, yes. More withdrawn, certainly. But there was also a strange clarity to him, like someone who had been given instructions they hadn't fully translated yet. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried a weight that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. He avoided mirrors. That wasn't fear, either. It was distraction. As if seeing his own reflection interrupted something more important. And then the symptoms began to stack up, one by one, each explainable on its own, but horrifying in accumulation. He stopped sleeping through the night. Not insomnia exactly, he slept in fragments, waking at precise intervals, always at the same times. He complained that the dark felt different now. Thicker. Closer. As if it pressed inward when the lights went out. He began losing time. Minutes at first. Then hours. He'd go for a walk and return long after sunset, shoes soaked with mud he couldn't account for. When asked where he'd been, he'd hesitate, searching his memory like someone flipping through pages that had been torn out. He never said he didn't remember. He said it didn't feel important. That's when the people around him started to worry. And that's also when they made the fatal mistake of assuming concern was enough. Here's my personal opinion, and I want to be very clear about it. Whatever entered his life after that accident did not arrive violently. It didn't crash through his mind like a wrecking ball. It seeped in through the cracks that were already there. Through exhaustion, through isolation, through the human desire to make sense of suffering. He became hypersensitive to sound, not loud noises, subtle ones. The creak of wood settling, the rustle of leaves outside his window, the almost imperceptible shift of air when no door had opened. He said it felt like listening to a language he almost understood. Doctors floated diagnoses, concussion symptoms, dissociation, anxiety disorders. Medication was suggested, follow-up scheduled, but he resisted them, not with paranoia, but with certainty. He said, if I numb this, I'll miss it. Miss what was never clarified. What truly unsettled me was how calm he was about all of it. Not distressed, not panicked, just attentive. As if his life had become a waiting room and he was listening for his name to be called. The forest called more often after that. Not audibly, not directly. But every road he took curved toward it. Every conversation circled back to it. He described feeling pulled, like gravity had shifted, and he was slowly sliding towards something he couldn't yet see. And the worst part, the part I can't rationalize away, is that he seemed relieved. That frightens me more than any scream ever could. Because relief means acceptance. The accident didn't damage his brain in the way people expected. It didn't break him. It opened something. A door, if you like metaphors. A threshold. A place where the boundaries between internal and external blurred just enough for influence to slip through unnoticed. And once that door was open, it didn't matter how gentle he was before. It didn't matter that violence repulsed him. It didn't matter that he had spent his life avoiding harm. Because something else had learned how to stand where his certainty used to be. I don't believe the forest caused the accident. I believe the accident made him visible. And once something ancient knows you're there, once it realizes you can hear it, even faintly, it doesn't need to rush. It knows you'll come back on your own. That's the real horror of what happened to him. Not the injuries. Not the symptoms. Not even the visions. It's the possibility that the most dangerous transformations don't announce themselves with pain. They arrive quietly, disguised as insight. And by the time you realize what you've let in, the door no longer belongs to you. People like to believe that safety is a matter of distance. As long as danger stays in the woods, they think, as long as it remains among the trees and the shadows, and the places no one is supposed to linger, then whatever evil exists out there can be contained, controlled, avoided. That belief is comforting, and completely wrong. The house he moved into sat just far enough from the forest to give the illusion of separation. From the front porch, you could see sunlight spilling across the gravel driveway, the sky wide and open above. But behind the house, always behind it, the trees rose up in a solid wall of green and black, their branches interlacing like fingers locked together in prayer or conspiracy. The locals called it a retreat, a quiet place, a refuge for people who needed to disappear for a while without truly vanishing. Writers, artists, thinkers, people whose minds ran too loudly to survive in cities. The woman who owned it had lived there for decades. She was the kind of person who made others feel immediately understood, the kind who listened without interrupting and spoke without judgment. People described her as maternal, grounding, safe. Someone who believed deeply in second chances and quiet healing. She welcomed him without hesitation. I want to pause here and say something clearly. Because this matters, there was nothing sinister about her. No hidden agenda. No secret knowledge. She wasn't a guardian of the forest, or a cult leader, or anything dramatic like that. She was just kind. And in my opinion, that's what doomed her. From the moment he arrived, the house reacted to him in ways no one could quite articulate. Doors creaked more often. Floorboards groaned even when no one walked on them. At night, the old structure seemed to settle and breathe, as if adjusting to a new presence. He said it felt like the house was listening. The first few weeks passed quietly, almost peacefully. He helped with chores, shared meals, spoke softly and gratefully about how much better he felt being there. The woman believed, genuinely, that the calm environment was helping him recover. That distance from the noise of the world was allowing his mind to rest. But rest and stillness are not the same thing. At night, he began sitting by the window in his room, staring into the forest long after darkness swallowed the tree line. Not searching, not watching, waiting. When asked what he was doing, he would smile faintly and say he was thinking, or listening to the quiet, or simply enjoying the view. His tone was reassuring, but something about it felt rehearsed, like an answer chosen because it required no follow-up questions. The woman noticed the change in the house before she noticed the change in him. She mentioned once, almost jokingly, that the forest seemed closer than it used to. That the trees looked darker somehow, heavier. He nodded when she said this, not surprised, not alarmed. As if she had just confirmed something he already knew. This is where my personal opinion becomes impossible to ignore. I don't think the forest was moving. I think his sense of boundaries was shrinking. He spent less time with the other residents. Less time indoors altogether. Meals were skipped. Conversations shortened. He drifted through shared spaces like a guest who had already said goodbye. And yet this is crucial, he was never hostile. Never threatening. Never cruel. That's the trap. We are conditioned to look for danger in sharp edges, in raised voices, in visible aggression. We don't know how to respond to someone who withdraws so completely that their absence becomes louder than any outburst ever could. At night, the woman heard footsteps outside the house, not pacing, not approaching, just standing, pausing, shifting weight from one foot to the other, as if someone or something was deciding where to go next. When she mentioned it to him the next morning, he said the forest made noises like that all the time. He said it gently, comfortingly. And then he added, almost as an afterthought, it doesn't mean harm. It just doesn't like being ignored. She laughed it off. Of course she did. What else could she do? I think about that moment often. About how easily unease is dismissed when it arrives wrapped in calmness. About how danger sometimes speaks in a voice that sounds almost reasonable. The house was not at the center of the forest. That distinction mattered. It sat at the threshold, a place caught between human order and something far older. A place where rules blurred. Thresholds are dangerous. He began rearranging his room without explanation. Furniture shifted away from walls. Windows left uncovered at night. The bed moved closer to the floor, as if height had become uncomfortable. When asked why, he said he slept better that way. But he didn't sleep better. He barely slept at all. The woman noticed that his eyes no longer adjusted to light the way they used to. In dim rooms, they seemed almost reflective, catching shadows instead of clarity. It was subtle, easy to rationalize. Everything about him was easy to rationalize. Until it wasn't. One evening, she found him standing in the backyard, just steps from where grass gave way to roots and undergrowth. He hadn't announced himself. He hadn't responded when she called his name. He stood completely still, shoulders relaxed, arms at his sides. Not entranced. Attentive. She asked him if he was okay. He turned slowly, as if turning took effort, and looked at her with an expression she would later struggle to describe. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. He said, "This is where it gets quiet enough." That sentence doesn't sound threatening on its own, but context gives words their teeth. Quiet enough for what? The house, in my opinion, was never meant to protect anyone. It was never a sanctuary. It was a bridge. A place people came to lower their defenses, to soften, to open themselves emotionally. And whatever lived in those woods didn't need force. It needed access. The woman believed she was offering safety. She believed kindness could stabilize a mind in distress. She believed that patience and warmth were enough to counteract whatever darkness he carried with him. She was wrong. Not because kindness is weak, but because some things do not oppose kindness. They exploit it. By the time she began to feel truly afraid, it was no longer fear of him. It was fear for him. The sense that something had already stepped into the space where help was supposed to go. And that is the most helpless position a human being can occupy. The house did not stand between him and the forest. It stood open. And in my view, once that threshold was crossed, not physically, but psychologically, there was no version of this story that ended quietly. Because when a place like that accepts you, it doesn't ask permission. It waits until you stop asking questions. And the woods were very patient. People expect evil to announce itself. They expect shouting, violence, threats. Some visible rupture in reality that makes it obvious when the line has been crossed. We grow up believing that danger makes noise, that it rattles doors and raises voices and leaves marks behind. But the most devastating force in this story never screamed. It didn't need to. By the time the change became undeniable, the man was no longer reacting to the world around him. He was responding to something beneath it. Something quieter than thought, more patient than fear. The woman noticed first that pain no longer seemed to register the way it should. It wasn't dramatic. There was no test, no moment where he proved himself invulnerable. It showed itself in small, unsettling ways: burns he didn't flinch from, cuts he didn't acknowledge, the casual disregard for discomfort that usually anchors a person to their body. When she asked if he was hurt, he would look down at the injury, as if noticing it for the first time, and say, calmly, "It doesn't matter." That sentence is more frightening than any scream I've ever heard. Because pain exists for a reason. It is the body's last defense, the final argument against destruction. When someone stops listening to it, they are no longer negotiating with reality. He stopped locking doors. Not out of carelessness. Out of conviction. He said locks were for things that needed protection. He said the house didn't need that anymore. He said, with unsettling confidence, that nothing bad would come inside unless it was already invited. The way he spoke about harm had changed too. Not just harm toward himself, but harm as a concept. He no longer framed it as something to be avoided. He framed it as something misunderstood. Necessary, even. Pain clarifies, he said once, standing near the tree line as dusk swallowed the yard. It strips away the noise. I want to be very clear here. At no point did he express anger. At no point did he threaten anyone. There was no explosion of rage, no sudden cruelty that would have justified immediate fear. Instead, there was calm. A calm so absolute it erased urgency. This is where my personal opinion becomes unavoidable, and I won't soften it. I do not believe the forest turned him violent. I believe it taught him that violence didn't require emotion. That distinction matters. Emotion makes actions human. Anger, fear, desperation, those things tether us to consequence. But when someone believes they are acting as an instrument rather than an individual, morality becomes irrelevant. The devil doesn't scream because screaming is persuasion. And persuasion implies resistance. Whatever had wrapped itself around his thoughts no longer needed to convince him of anything. He had already accepted its presence as fact, its influence as natural. Neighbors later described seeing him walk barefoot across gravel without reacting. Standing in the rain for hours, unmoving. Watching the woods as if expecting them to answer. But here's the detail that still makes my stomach tighten. Children felt uneasy around him. Not frightened. Uneasy. Children sense shifts adults rationalize away. They notice when someone is no longer fully occupying their body. When their attention feels split. When their eyes don't quite land where they're supposed to. One child told her mother that he felt empty in the wrong places. That sentence never appeared in any report. It didn't need to. It says more than evidence ever could. The woman, the one who believed in safety, in kindness, in patience, began to sense that something irreversible was approaching. Not because of any single act, but because of the absence of hesitation. Hesitation is what keeps people from crossing lines. It's the pause where doubt lives. He no longer paused. When she confronted him gently, asking if he felt like himself, he smiled with genuine warmth and said, "I feel more like myself than I ever have." That's the lie that ends everything. Because when someone believes they have finally become who they were meant to be, they will sacrifice anything that contradicts that belief, including the people who love them. He began speaking about the forest not as a place, but as a presence with boundaries and preferences. He said it didn't like loud emotions. That anger agitated it. That fear disrupted its stillness. But obedience was rewarded. He never described rewards as pleasure. He described them as alignment, as relief, as the absence of internal friction. And this is where the horror turns inward, where it stops being about woods or houses or accidents and becomes something much closer to home. Because every human being longs, at some point, for that kind of relief. The relief of certainty. The relief of surrender. The relief of not having to decide. I believe that's why the devil doesn't scream. Screaming demands attention. It provokes resistance. It wakes people up. But silence. Silence invites you to lean closer, to listen harder, to fill the gaps with your own meaning. By the time the woman realized, she was no longer dealing with a man who could be reasoned with. It wasn't because he had done something monstrous. It was because he no longer saw the possibility of monstrosity at all. Good and evil had flattened into function. Necessary and unnecessary. Aligned and misaligned. And when morality is reduced to efficiency, there is nothing left to restrain what comes next. I often hear people ask why she didn't leave sooner, why she didn't call for help, why no one intervened before things escalated. Those questions miss the point. You don't flee from something that hasn't shown its teeth. You don't call the police on calmness. You don't recognize danger when it feels like peace. And whatever lived in those woods understood that perfectly. It didn't push him. It didn't rush him. It simply removed every internal barrier that might have stopped him when the moment arrived. The devil doesn't scream. Because by the time you realize you should be afraid, fear is no longer part of the equation. And that, in my opinion, is the most terrifying thing of all. There is a moment in every tragedy when the people on the outside begin to notice that something is wrong, but not wrong enough to act. That is the most dangerous moment of all. The neighbors did not see a monster. They did not see violence. They did not see a man unraveling in ways that demanded immediate intervention. What they saw was something far more confusing and far more unsettling in hindsight. A man who no longer behaved like other people. He didn't wave when spoken to. Not out of rudeness, but absence. His attention slid past faces, past voices, past social expectation, like those things no longer registered as meaningful stimuli. When someone greeted him, he responded a beat too late, as if translating from a language he had only recently learned. And then there were the eyes. Multiple people mentioned them independently, which is the detail that matters most. When witnesses who have never spoken to one another describe the same unease using the same words, it stops being coincidence. They said his eyes didn't reflect light properly, not in a supernatural glow in the dark way. Nothing dramatic, just flat, absorptive, as if whatever usually bounced back from a human gaze was being swallowed instead. One neighbor, a retired electrician who had lived near the forest for 30 years, described it like this: it felt like looking into a room with the lights off and realizing someone was standing just inside the doorway. Another said that when he looked at her, she felt the sudden, irrational urge to look away, not out of fear, but embarrassment. Like she had walked in on something private. That reaction is important. Fear makes you freeze or flee. Embarrassment makes you retreat. Whatever people sensed in him didn't feel predatory. It felt intrusive. As if his presence crossed an unspoken boundary without acknowledging it. He was often seen standing at the edge of the road near the property, especially in the early morning hours when fog clung low to the ground. He didn't pace. He didn't wander. He stood, still, upright, facing the forest, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Cars would slow as they passed him. Drivers would glance back in their mirrors, expecting to see him moving, or waving, or reacting in some way to their presence. He never did. A woman who drove that road daily said she began altering her schedule to avoid passing him at dawn. Not because she felt threatened, but because something about seeing him there made the rest of her day feel wrong, like a bad note played at the beginning of a song. Children walking home from school crossed the street to avoid passing him. They couldn't articulate why. They just knew they didn't want to be close. And here's the part that unsettles me most. The part I can't dismiss no matter how hard I try. Animals avoided him. Dogs that barked at everything went silent when he passed. Horses shifted nervously in their enclosures, whites of their eyes visible, ears pinned back. Birds took flight from nearby trees when he approached, not in alarm, but in coordinated retreat. Predators recognize shifts in the environment long before humans do. One neighbor, an amateur wildlife photographer, told police later that when he tried to photograph the man from a distance, his camera malfunctioned. Battery drained instantly. He laughed it off at the time. Electronics fail all the time. But then it happened again. And again. Always when the man was in frame. What the neighbors didn't see were conversations. They didn't hear arguments. They didn't witness breakdowns or outbursts. There was no public escalation, no clear point at which someone could have said, "This is when it became dangerous." That's why no one intervened. Danger didn't arrive loudly. It arrived normalized. He became part of the landscape. Just another quiet figure near the woods. Just another eccentric soul drawn to isolation. Just another person choosing not to engage. And I believe that was intentional. In my personal opinion, whatever influence had settled over him understood something fundamental about human behavior. We ignore what doesn't demand us. We tune out stillness. We dismiss silence. We rationalize calm. One neighbor finally spoke to him directly, driven less by concern and more by curiosity. He asked him what he was doing out there every morning. The man turned, slowly, deliberately, and said, "Making sure I'm still here." The neighbor laughed, uncertain how to respond. He said something light in return, something about needing coffee to feel present himself. He expected a smile. Instead, the man studied him for a long moment and replied, "You don't disappear all at once. You fade." That was the end of the conversation. The neighbor would later describe feeling cold for hours afterward, as if the temperature around him had dropped without explanation. Another person overheard him speaking quietly to himself, or what they assumed was himself, near the trees late one evening. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Not frantic, not emotional, reverent, as if responding to instructions. People began closing their curtains at night, not because they believed he would do anything to them, but because they didn't want to see him if he was standing outside. There is a profound difference between fear of harm and fear of presence. Presence lingers. Presence watches. Presence changes the air in a room. One neighbor described waking in the middle of the night with the unshakable feeling that someone was standing just outside his window. When he looked, there was no one there. No footprints. No sign of disturbance. But in the morning, he found muddy impressions near the edge of the property barefoot. That detail spread quickly, though quietly. Whispers, side glances, conversations that ended when someone approached. Still, no one called authorities. What would they say? There was a man near the woods. He stood still. He looked strange. He made people uncomfortable. That's not a crime. That's not even a warning sign, according to most standards. And that's the point I want to hammer home, because it terrifies me in a way nothing else in this story does. The neighbors saw the aftermath before the event. They saw the absence of humanity before the violence ever arrived. But we are not trained to recognize that kind of danger. We are trained to look for disruption, not depletion. We look for chaos, not vacancy. By the time someone finally admitted quietly, reluctantly, that they were afraid of him, it was no longer because of anything he might do. It was because of what he no longer was. He no longer reacted. He no longer hesitated. He no longer belonged to the same emotional gravity as everyone else. And once a person drifts that far out of orbit, the fall back to Earth is never gentle. In my opinion, this was the last chance to change what happened next. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through recognition. And recognition never came. Because it's hard to name a threat that doesn't snarl. It's hard to fear a man who never raises his voice. It's hard to accept that silence can be more dangerous than rage. The neighbors saw him. They just didn't see him in time. And the woods, as always, were watching. People like to believe that belief itself is harmless. Faith, spirituality, ritual, community. We are taught that these things heal, that they give structure to suffering, that they provide answers when logic runs out. And most of the time, that's true. Belief can be a lifeline when reality feels unbearable. But belief has a shadow. And when that shadow is fed fear instead of understanding, it stops being a refuge. It becomes a weapon. Someone suggested the group quietly, cautiously, as if testing the air before speaking. Not a church exactly. Not a cult, either. Just a gathering of people who believed that some experiences could not be explained by medicine or psychology alone. People who believed that modern life had stripped meaning from pain, and that suffering, when properly interpreted, was a message. They met in a converted community hall a few miles from the forest. The building was old but clean, lit softly, intentionally dim. The kind of place designed to make you lower your voice without being asked. The man attended his first meeting without hesitation. That detail matters. He didn't resist. He didn't doubt. He didn't ask whether this was necessary. He arrived as if fulfilling an appointment he had already accepted somewhere else. The group welcomed him warmly. They always did. Their kindness was sincere, their concern genuine. They listened as he spoke, not frantically, not incoherently, but calmly, thoughtfully, about feeling watched, guided, aligned, about the forest's stillness, about the relief of surrendering to something larger than himself. They didn't interrupt. That was the first mistake. Instead of questioning the source of his certainty, they questioned its interpretation. Instead of asking whether something external was influencing him, they asked what kind of presence it might be. They framed his experience as sensitivity, as openness, as a gift. I want to stop here and say something that may be uncomfortable. I don't believe these people were malicious. I believe they were afraid. Afraid of randomness. Afraid of mental illness. Afraid of the idea that a human mind could fracture without purpose or design. And fear, when wrapped in belief, becomes conviction very quickly. The group spoke about spiritual thresholds, about places where the veil between worlds thinned, about energies that attached themselves to people who wandered too far from emotional balance. They spoke about the forest. They didn't say it was evil. Not directly. They said it was old, that it remembered things people had forgotten, that it responded to those who listened too closely. They spoke about cleansing, about grounding, about rituals meant to realign a person with themselves. And the man listened. He listened with the same attentiveness the neighbors had seen, the same stillness, the same absence of resistance. He did not question whether the explanations made sense. He accepted them. In my personal opinion, this was the moment everything became irreversible. Because once someone tells you that what you are experiencing has meaning, cosmic, spiritual, chosen meaning, it becomes very difficult to let go of it. Suffering becomes identity. Confusion becomes destiny. The group decided he needed help releasing whatever had attached itself to him. Not medical help. Not psychological evaluation. Spiritual intervention. They gathered in the hall late one evening, lights low, voices hushed. Candles were lit not for drama, but focus. They placed him in the center of the room, not restrained, not forced. He sat willingly, hands relaxed, posture open. He did not look distressed. That's the detail I can't escape. As they began to speak soft prayers, affirmations, words meant to anchor and protect, he began to respond. Not violently. Not with rage or panic. With recognition. He repeated phrases they hadn't taught him. He finished sentences they hadn't completed. He spoke about alignment and silence and stillness, as if these were shared concepts long agreed upon. When they asked what he felt, he said, "Closer." Someone suggested there was resistance within him, something that needed to be confronted. Another suggested there were multiple influences at work, layered, entangled. They spoke of purification, as if it were a technical process. And still, he remained calm. Here is where belief crosses into something dangerous. They began to treat his lack of distress as proof of depth rather than warning. His composure became evidence that whatever influence they were dealing with was sophisticated, subtle, patient. They were right about one thing. They just misunderstood who was being influenced. As the session continued, the air in the room grew heavy, not ominous, but oppressive, like pressure building before a storm. People shifted uncomfortably. Some later described feeling dizzy, nauseous, emotionally exposed. The man did not. He seemed steadier than ever. When someone asked him if he wanted whatever was affecting him to leave, he paused. Just for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "It's not inside me." That sentence changed everything. Because if the influence wasn't inside him, then where was it? The group interpreted his words as metaphor, as spiritual displacement. They began speaking about separation, about closing doors, about reclaiming personal space. They raised their voices slightly, not in anger but urgency. And that's when he flinched for the first time. Not at pain, not at fear, at noise. He asked them to lower their voices. He said it disrupted the balance. He said whatever they were trying to help him with didn't respond well to being challenged. Someone insisted they continue. Someone else suggested they stop. The man stood up. No sudden movement. No aggression. He simply rose to his feet, and the room fell silent. He looked around at them not with hostility, not with confusion, but with something that felt like disappointment. "You invited it," he said. "Now you want to argue with it." People laughed nervously. Someone suggested a break. The session ended shortly after. They told themselves they had done what they could. That progress takes time. That not every spiritual struggle resolves immediately. But here is my firm belief, and I will not soften it. They didn't cast anything out. They named it. And naming something gives it shape, gives it boundaries, gives it legitimacy. From that night on, the man stopped questioning whether what he felt was real. He stopped wondering if his experiences were symptoms or signals. They had given him a framework where doubt no longer belonged. And once doubt is gone, restraint soon follows. The devil we invited inside didn't arrive through violence or possession or ritual failure. It arrived through interpretation, through the human need to explain the unexplainable in a way that feels intentional rather than terrifyingly random. By trying to help him understand what was happening, they helped him accept it. And in doing so, they removed the last barrier between influence and action. This is the part of the story that frightens me the most, because it doesn't require malice or madness. It only requires certainty. And certainty, once it hardens, does not ask permission before it destroys everything in its path. The woods didn't need to enter the room. The people brought the forest with them. And from that point on, there was nothing left to keep the door closed. That night did not announce itself. There was no storm, no warning sirens, no sense that the air had shifted toward catastrophe. The sky was clear enough to reveal stars, though they looked dimmer than usual, as if seen through a thin film of glass. The forest stood perfectly still, branches unmoving, leaves locked in place, as though the entire ecosystem had agreed to pause. Silence like that is not natural. It was the kind of quiet that presses inward, the kind that makes even your own breathing feel intrusive. People often say silence is peaceful, but they're confusing it with absence. This was not absence. This was attention. The man left his room just after dusk. No hurry. No preparation. He didn't pack a bag or leave a note or perform any ritual that might have suggested significance. He walked as if following a routine he had rehearsed many times internally. Those who would later retrace his steps noted something strange. He didn't go straight toward the forest. He circled the house first. Slowly, methodically, not searching, not checking doors, just walking the perimeter, one complete loop, as if acknowledging the boundary between where he had been and where he was about to go. I can't stop thinking about that detail, because it suggests respect. The woman noticed him from the kitchen window. She watched him move through the yard, his silhouette dark against the darker line of trees beyond. She considered calling out to him, but something held her back. Not fear, not suspicion, recognition. She said later that she had the sudden, overwhelming sense that interrupting him would be inappropriate, like speaking during a funeral prayer. That instinct may have saved her from immediate confrontation. It did not save her from what came next. He did not look back at the house as he approached the trees. Not once. He didn't hesitate at the edge of the forest either. He stepped into the undergrowth, as if stepping through a doorway that had been open all along. And this is where the story becomes difficult to tell, not because of violence, but because of absence. There were no screams, no sounds of struggle, no sudden chaos that might have drawn attention or intervention. Whatever happened unfolded in the same quiet that had settled over the land hours earlier. Neighbors later reported that the forest seemed different that night. Not louder, not darker, deeper. As if the space between trees had expanded, swallowing distance and perspective. One man said the woods looked closer to the road than they had that morning, though he couldn't explain how or why. Animals vanished. Crickets stopped chirping. Dogs refused to go outside. Horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, eyes rolling, breath shallow, as if sensing a pressure their owners could not. And inside the house, time seemed to stretch. The woman moved from room to room, unable to settle, unable to articulate what was wrong. She checked the clocks repeatedly, convinced they had stopped, only to find they were ticking normally. Normal time. Abnormal feeling. This is the part people misunderstand when they look back and ask why she didn't leave. Because fear did not feel like the correct response. The sensation was closer to inevitability. Like standing on a platform after the train has already left, knowing you are too late for something you can't name. At some point, no one can say exactly when he returned to the house. There was no sound announcing his arrival. No footsteps. No door opening. No warning at all. He simply was there. Later, investigators would struggle to reconstruct the sequence of events inside the house. Not because of chaos, but because of order. Objects were not overturned. There was no sign of panic. Nothing suggested a fight. The house looked as it always had. Which, in my opinion, is the most disturbing detail of all. Because disorder would have implied resistance. And there was none. The woman had trusted him. Not blindly, but deeply. She believed in the version of him that had existed before certainty replaced doubt. She believed kindness could reach where force could not. I believe she approached him without fear. That belief is what makes this night unbearable to imagine. Whatever he did next was not fueled by anger or hatred or loss of control. It was precise, purposeful, quiet. The forest did not react. No wind, no movement, no sound. As if it were holding its breath. And then, when it was over, the silence did not break. It thickened. The neighbors noticed first when lights did not turn on the next morning. No movement. No routine. No sign of life from a house that usually greeted the day softly but reliably. They told themselves stories. She was sleeping in. They had gone away. Everything was fine. People cling to normal explanations even as dread coils in their stomachs. By the time anyone approached the house, the forest had already reclaimed the moment. The man was gone. Not fleeing. Not hiding. Gone in the way things disappear when they were never meant to remain. Authorities would later describe his absence clinically as if it were a logistical problem rather than a metaphysical one. They would speculate about where he might have gone, how far he could have traveled, what state of mind he must have been in. They would miss the most important truth entirely. He didn't leave. He returned. That night did not belong to the house or the people inside it. It belonged to the woods. And the woods took exactly what they had been waiting for. I've thought about this moment more than any other in the story. About how violence does not always feel violent from the inside. About how the most horrifying acts can occur without chaos, without spectacle, without any outward sign that something has gone terribly wrong. Because when meaning replaces morality, action becomes obligation, and obligation does not hesitate. The forest did not roar or rage or reveal itself in some cinematic display of power. It simply accepted what was offered. And in doing so, it erased the last fragile barrier between a man who once feared violence and the irreversible consequences of certainty. This was the night the forest took everything, not by force, but by permission. And in my opinion, that is the most terrifying ending any place could ever demand. The morning after was painfully ordinary. That detail alone should have felt wrong. The sun rose on schedule. Fog lifted from the road in slow, lazy sheets. Birds returned. Cautiously at first, then louder, as if reassured by the absence of something they had sensed the night before. From a distance, the house looked unchanged, still standing, still intact, still pretending to belong to the living. It was the kind of normalcy that feels insulting after something irreversible has occurred. When authorities finally entered the property, they did so expecting disorder. That's what violence leaves behind. Broken things. Obvious disruption. A visual language that says, something went wrong here. They didn't find that. They found stillness. The house was quiet in a way that felt preserved rather than abandoned. Furniture remained where it belonged. No overturned chairs. No shattered glass. No evidence of panic or flight. It looked less like the aftermath of a crime and more like a place paused mid-breath. And that unnerved them. Investigators are trained to read chaos. They know how to reconstruct events when emotions run high, when people fight back, when fear takes control. But this scene offered nothing familiar to follow. No struggle. No defensive wounds. No clear sequence. Just an ending without punctuation. They searched for substances first. That was expected. Drugs explain a lot of things people don't want to examine too closely. They soften responsibility. They give behavior an external cause. But the tests came back clean. No alcohol. No narcotics. No hallucinogens. No medication misuse. Nothing that could account for what had happened. That absence echoed louder than any positive result ever could. Psychological evaluations followed, built from interviews, journals, fragments of conversations gathered secondhand. Diagnoses were suggested carefully, reluctantly. Severe dissociation. Delusional ideation. Possible, untreated neurological trauma. Possible. 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 No one wanted to say definitive. Because definitives imply understanding. And no one understood this. The man was nowhere to be found. Search teams combed the forest in expanding circles, following protocols refined over decades. Dogs were brought in. Drones flew overhead. Rangers traced trails he was known to frequent. The forest gave nothing back. No footprints. No clothing. No blood. No sign of departure. It was as if he had stepped into a place that did not allow return paths. One search leader later admitted off record that the woods felt different during those days. Not hostile. Not dangerous. Closed. As if the terrain itself had decided the search was unnecessary. I want to make my position clear here, because this is where stories like this often collapse into cheap mystery or sensationalism. I am not saying something supernatural erased him. I am saying that whatever happened to him removed the need for escape. Those are not the same thing. In his room, they found notebooks. Most were filled with scattered thoughts, sketches, fragments of ideas that had no obvious order. Symbols repeated variations of circles broken by vertical lines, tree-like forms that looked less botanical and more anatomical. But near the back of one notebook, written carefully, deliberately, was a sentence repeated over and over in slightly different handwriting. "It's still watching." No context, no elaboration. Just that. Investigators debated what it referred to. Psychologists leaned toward projection, stress-induced fixation, a symbolic representation of internalized fear or guilt. All reasonable, all insufficient. Because that sentence wasn't frantic. It wasn't scrawled. It wasn't obsessive in the way panic manifests. It was calm, observational, as if noting a fact rather than expressing concern. The community reacted the way communities always do when faced with something they can't explain. They closed ranks. Some people insisted the forest had nothing to do with it. Others said it had always been dangerous, that everyone knew better than to get too close. A few quietly admitted they had felt something was wrong long before the night it all ended. But those admissions came too late to matter. What unsettled me most, and still does, was how quickly the story became simplified. A troubled man. A tragic outcome. No further questions necessary. That narrative allows everyone else to sleep at night. It creates distance. Because if this was just an individual breakdown, then it says nothing about the rest of us. It doesn't ask us to examine belief, certainty, or the fragile line between meaning and delusion. It doesn't ask us to look at the places we retreat to when the world becomes unbearable. I don't accept that version of events. Not because I believe in monsters hiding in the woods, but because I believe in how easily humans can surrender responsibility when offered an explanation that feels complete. The absence of drugs matters. The absence of a clear motive matters. The absence of fear matters. What happened did not feel like loss of control. It felt like conclusion. The official reports close with language that suggests exhaustion rather than certainty. Phrases like unable to determine and insufficient evidence appear more often than conclusions. The case remains technically open, but functionally dormant, unresolved. And unresolved things don't disappear. They settle. They become part of the environment. People still avoid the trail behind the house. They don't say why. They don't need to. The air there feels heavier. Conversations drop off. Footsteps slow. Even now, years later, someone will occasionally mention seeing a figure near the tree line at dawn or dusk. Standing. Still. Watching. Authorities dismiss these sightings gently. Memory is unreliable. Grief distorts perception. Stories grow in the telling. They are probably right. But probability has never been a comfort to me. Because this story does not frighten me due to unanswered questions. It frightens me because of the answers we were too quick to accept. No drugs. No explanation. No closure. Just a quiet agreement to move on. And in my opinion, that's the final failure. Because when we choose not to understand, we leave the door open for the same thing to happen again, somewhere else. To someone else, in a place that feels just as safe right up until it isn't. The forest did not confess. It didn't have to. It had already been believed. I went back to the forest years later. I told myself it was curiosity, professional obligation, closure. Pick whichever lie feels most comfortable. The truth is simpler and harder to admit. I needed to know whether the place remembered what it had taken. The road looked the same. The trees were taller, thicker, their branches heavier with time. Moss still clung to everything, swallowing sharp edges, softening outlines. From a distance, nothing about the forest suggested danger. No signs warning people away. No markers acknowledging what had happened there. Just trees. Just quiet. Just a place people still insisted was harmless if you respected it. That word again. Respect. I parked where others had parked before me. I stood where others had stood. I breathed the same damp air, listened to the same muted sounds. And immediately, unmistakably, I felt it. Not fear. Recognition. It's difficult to explain what it's like to feel unwelcome without feeling threatened. The forest did not feel hostile. It did not feel predatory. It felt indifferent in a way that stripped me of importance. Like standing in front of something that had existed long before the concept of mercy ever mattered. I did not go deep inside. I didn't need to. Some places communicate everything you need to know at the threshold. I stood there longer than I meant to. Long enough for the sounds behind me, the road, the distant world of schedules and consequences, to fade into irrelevance. Long enough for my thoughts to slow, to simplify, to flatten into something dangerously calm. And that's when I understood what terrified me most about this story. The forest does not lure people with fear. It offers relief. Relief from noise, from conflict, from the exhausting burden of choice. It offers stillness so complete it feels like clarity. And for people who are already tired, already fractured, already searching for meaning, it feels like mercy. I believe the man felt that mercy. I believe he experienced the forest not as a threat, but as an answer. And that's why I reject the idea that what happened was madness alone. Not because mental illness wasn't involved, it absolutely was, but because that explanation is too small to hold what this place represents. This wasn't possession. It was permission. Permission to stop resisting. Permission to stop questioning. Permission to stop being human in the way we usually define it. We talk about the devil as if it's something external. A force that attacks, corrupts, invades. But the longer I sit with this story, the more convinced I become that this framing lets us off the hook far too easily. The devil doesn't need to arrive. It waits for us to make room. It waits for certainty to replace doubt, for meaning to replace morality, for stillness to replace conscience. And when that happens, it doesn't scream. It doesn't have to. Standing at the edge of those trees, I realize something else, something I wish I didn't believe, but can't unlearn. The forest didn't change after that night. It didn't become darker. It didn't become more dangerous. It didn't become cursed. It simply continued. And that continuity is the most unsettling part of all. Because it means whatever happened, there was not an anomaly. It wasn't a rupture. It was a process that completed itself exactly as intended. People still walk those trails. Still retreat into the woods when life becomes too loud. Still mistake isolation for healing, silence for peace. And sometimes, rarely, quietly, someone doesn't come back the same. Or doesn't come back at all. I don't believe the devil lives in the woods. That would be too simple. Too comforting. I believe the woods remember him. They remember what happens when humans stop fighting the urge to disappear. When they stop insisting on responsibility. When they decide that being chosen feels better than being accountable. And if that memory exists, if it lingers in places like this, then the danger isn't confined to one forest, or one house, or one man who lost himself too completely. It exists anywhere certainty goes unquestioned. Anywhere belief replaces reflection. Anywhere silence feels like truth. That's why this story doesn't end when the search does. That's why the case file's closing didn't bring relief. That's why I still think about it. Because the devil didn't leave with him. It stayed. Not in the trees. Not in the soil. But in the idea that surrender can feel like peace. And if that idea takes root in the wrong mind, at the wrong time, in the wrong place, The forest won't have to do anything at all. It will simply watch.